highway ran straight for hours, cutting through the hills like a wound that never closed. I remember the color of the clouds before the rain came. Thin, bruised, almost the same tone as the asphalt. I had been driving too long enough that the white lines began to slip apart. I wanted somewhere to stop, somewhere that wasn't another chain store or empty diner with buzzing lights. When the first sign appeared, it barely stood. A rusted board hanging from one nail. Flea market. Under bridge. I followed it. The road narrowed until it turned to gravel. Below the bridge, the air was thick, heavier than the weather should allow. The sound of the river mixed with a faint hum. Old radios, metal scraping, something boiling in tin pots. I parked beside a row of forgotten cars, their windows smeared with dust and fingerprints too small to belong to adults. The market wasn't large, just a few tables lined in uneven rows, each lit by hanging bulbs, swaying from cables strung across the beams above. Everything was damp, half rotting, as if the rain here never really ended. At the far end, past the stalls of broken glass and antique clocks, an old woman sat motionless behind a folding table. Her skin looked like paper kept too close to heat. She didn't speak when I stopped. Her table was almost empty. Only a few cracked porcelain dolls, a jar of teeth, a bundle of keys, and hanging above all of it, a single Dreamcatcher. It was darker than the rest. Black and red thread woven so tightly the colors bled into each other. The feathers below were wrong, too thick, too long. They didn't taper like feathers. They frayed, splitting into fine strands that tangled in the air. Hair. It looked like hair. Some black, some deep brown, one or two still glinting red under the light. The circle itself wasn't round. It leaned inward at the top, bent as if someone had crushed it in a shaking hand. I asked her how much. She didn't move. For a moment I thought she hadn't heard me. But then her head lifted slightly. The eyes that met mine were clouded, not from age, but from something behind them, like smoke trapped under glass. Her voice came out like air escaping a leak. 5, luck for your sleep. 5 what? I handed her a bill. Her fingers brushed mine. They were sticky, faintly warm, like sap. She nodded once, pulled a strip of brown paper from under the table, and wrapped the Dreamcatcher with slow precision. Then she tied it with a thread she pulled from her sleeve. It was black, almost oily, and it clung to her skin as if reluctant to leave. When I turned to walk away, she said something else. Not loud, barely sound at all. It might have been, "Don't hang it high." Or maybe, "Don't hang where it breathes." The words blurred with the sound of the rain. The motel was less than a mile from the bridge. A single story of cracked windows and orange doors, lighted by a sign that buzzed louder than any insect I've ever heard. The room key was heavy, attached to a wooden tag carved with a number that had been sanded down and rewritten several times. Inside, the carpet was damp and the walls smelled faintly of smoke and mildew. I dropped my bag and the paper-wrapped Dreamcatcher on the nightstand. The air conditioner shuddered once and died. I didn't know why I took it out. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. The threads looked darker in the motel light, almost wet. I hung it from the ceiling lamp because there was nowhere else. The metal ring caught on the screw of the light fixture and turned slowly when the bulb flickered. When I switched off the lamp, the outline of it stayed visible for a while, a darker circle against the gray ceiling. I lay on the bed and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't a steady hum. It rose and fell like breathing, like the sound of someone trying not to be heard. The air thickened. The fabric of the blanket clung to my skin. I told myself it was just humidity. Something brushed my forehead, a strand, fine as hair. I reached up, thinking it was my own, but when my hand came down, nothing was there. Still, the sensation stayed, the feeling of something that didn't move with the air. I turned on the lamp again. The light made the shadow of the Dreamcatcher spill across the ceiling. One of the strands had come loose. It hung lower, just barely swaying. I stood on the bed, twisted the thread tighter around the ring, and stepped down. My hand came away smelling faintly metallic. The hum of the refrigerator stopped altogether. There was no silence after it. Only a hollow vibration, like a speaker left running after the song ends. I sat back on the bed. The room seemed to pulse faintly, corners bending closer each breath. The light above flickered once, twice, then steadied. The Dreamcatcher didn't move, but the air beneath it rippled slightly, as though something had exhaled. I stayed like that for a long time, waiting for nothing in particular. My skin itched where the light hit. Then something touched my neck, light, cold, slow. I reached up and found another thread, longer this time, sliding down from above. I followed it up with my eyes. It wasn't thread anymore. It was hair. Dozens of thin strands reaching from the ring, stretching down toward the bed. They didn't sway like normal hair. They twitched, uncertain, as though trying to decide where to land. I stepped back. My foot hit the nightstand, the lamp fell, and the light went out. Darkness filled the room, heavy and immediate. The sound returned, a low hum, deeper than before. I could still see the shape above me. The circle was wider now, the strands longer. They hung to my shoulders. Some brushed my arms, some touched my lips when I breathed. I didn't move. The hair didn't move either, but I could feel warmth pulsing through it. It wasn't cold anymore, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized. The air smelled faintly of copper. The night returned without warning. It always did. No sunset, no shift of color, only the sense that the air had stopped breathing. I must have fallen asleep. I'm sure I did. But when I opened my eyes, the room looked the same. The bulb above me hummed faintly, and the ceiling felt close enough to touch. The Dreamcatcher hung from the center of the light, unmoving. The threads no longer shone. They had dulled into something that looked like dried blood under glass. The longer I stared, the less I could tell if it was swaying or if my vision was. I turned on my side. The pillow clung to my face like damp paper. The air was thick, warm, faintly metallic. It smelled of the old woman's hands, iron, and something sweet that didn't belong in the air. I tried to ignore it, but the sound of the refrigerator began again. This time, it wasn't a hum. It was slower, deeper, like breathing that didn't match my own. I must have drifted off again, though I don't remember closing my eyes. I found myself standing in the same room, the same carpet, the same damp walls, but the Dreamcatcher was lower now. Its shadow spilled across the floor like smoke. When I stepped forward, the strands above shifted slightly, reacting to movement that wasn't mine. It reminded me of seaweed underwater, moving to currents I couldn't feel. There was a voice somewhere behind me. Not words, just the shape of them. I turned, but there was only the mirror on the closet door, half covered by grime. In it, I could see my own outline, but the reflection was slower. It blinked after I did. The Dreamcatcher appeared in the mirror too, behind me. In the reflection, the hair hung lower than it did in the room. I kept staring, waiting for it to stop moving, but it never did. The reflection's hair kept swaying long after mine had gone still. I blinked hard. The mirror was empty. When I lay back down, I told myself I was awake. The air was warmer though, and I could hear something small dragging across the floor near the bed. It was a soft sound, like cloth brushing against dust. I reached down, but my fingers met nothing. Just the carpet, wet, cold, sticky. The ceiling light flickered again. With each pulse, the room changed color for an instant, like the world between lightning strikes. In one flash, I saw the Dreamcatcher against the ceiling. In the next, it was higher, and in the next, it was gone. But the shadow on the floor never moved. I closed my eyes and tried to slow my breathing. When the hum came again, it was quieter. closer to my ear. The air pressed heavier against my chest. Something brushed across my face. Light, thin, like a thread carried by a breath. It moved across my nose, my lips, then stopped at my chin. I opened my eyes. Nothing. Only the faint shape of the ceiling, barely lit by the lamp that refused to die. I sat up. My heartbeat felt like it came from outside my body, echoing through the mattress. The Dreamcatcher was there again. It hadn't moved, but one of the threads had reached the pillow. I didn't sleep again that night, though I must have. The dreams kept starting in the same place. The moment before sleep, the light flickering, the air standing still. Each time, something changed just slightly. A strand lower, a breath longer. The sound of breathing coming from the wrong side of the room. In one dream, I saw the hair spill over the lamp, curling down toward me like smoke that had weight. When I woke, I could still smell it. Burnt dust and copper. I brushed at my blanket and found several strands caught in the fabric. They weren't mine. They were too coarse, too long, and one of them was tied in a small, perfect knot. I dropped them on the floor. They didn't fall like hair. They floated, slowly, as though the air itself refused to let them go. I stopped turning off the light after that. It didn't make a difference. The shadows grew anyway. They weren't darker than the rest. They just stayed longer, as if the light took its time forgetting them. The hum from the refrigerator became part of the room. When it stopped, my breathing stopped too. When it started again, I wasn't sure who had begun first. The air above my chest felt heavier. I could sense the strands hanging there, waiting for the weight of sleep to pull me under again. I didn't move. Neither did they. But the space between us throbbed faintly, a rhythm almost human, almost alive. When morning came, I didn't hear it. There was no light, no sound of cars, no change in the smell of the air, only the soft vibration that had followed me out of sleep. I sat up slowly. The hair was gone. The Dreamcatcher hung still. The lamp was off, but I hadn't touched the switch. For a long time, I watched it, waiting for proof that I was awake. Nothing moved, nothing changed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the room had stopped breathing. And when I closed my eyes again, the hum returned, steady, quiet, exactly where it had left off. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I remember the ceiling breathing with me, rising and falling as though the air had lungs. Every sound in the room had learned my rhythm. Even the silence moved when I did. The Dreamcatcher hung just above me, still black and red but darker now, almost wet in the glow of the lamp. The feathers, or the hair, had grown longer. They reached low enough to tremble when I shifted beneath the blanket. It was waiting for stillness. I could feel it. I turned on my side and tried to trick myself into rest, but my body refused. The air pressed against me from every angle, warm, faintly sweet, and metallic. It wasn't the air of the room anymore. It was the air from my dream. I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, everything had gone quiet. The lamp was still on, but the color had changed. It wasn't yellow now. It was pale and thin, like light filtered through water. Shadows quivered softly, pulsing to the same slow rhythm as my heartbeat. I tried to move my arm, but something brushed across my wrist. At first, I thought it was the blanket. I pulled back. The pressure followed. Soft cold. It wasn't tight, not yet. Just resting there. A thread, maybe two, sliding over my skin in slow circles. I waited for it to fall away. It didn't. It felt almost curious, like it was trying to measure me. My breath shortened. Every exhale made the thread move a little higher. By the time it reached my palm, I could feel the individual strands, thin, weightless, almost alive. They wrapped once around my fingers, paused, then loosened. I lifted my hand slowly. The hair followed. Not pulled by gravity, not falling. It followed. Each strand moved on its own, stretching upward toward the source above. When I stopped moving, it stopped too. The sound of the refrigerator had returned, but it wasn't in the corner anymore. It was under the bed, low, steady, and wet. I leaned slightly, trying to see beneath the frame. The hum deepened until I could feel it in my teeth. Then something brushed my ankle. The hair had reached the floor. It slid along the blanket, then climbed slowly over the edge. It didn't move in lines or coils. It unfolded, expanding like smoke given shape. A dozen strands, then 100, each one thin as breath, deliberate as thought. They spread in every direction, crawling across the carpet, climbing the legs of the bed, gathering around the mattress like a tide that refused to rise. I tried to sit up, but my wrists were already tangled. Not held, entangled. The hair didn't pull, it waited. Every time I exhaled, it tightened slightly, as if following the sound of my breath. It brushed the side of my neck. My pulse stuttered. The touch was colder now, faintly wet, like condensation forming from within. I froze. The strand stopped moving too. It hovered there, barely touching my skin. The air smelled faintly of iron and burnt dust. Something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't absence. It was listening. The hum had stopped, but the sound it left behind was sharper. I could hear my heartbeat through the threads. Each pulse sent a tremor up through them, as if the hair itself were alive to the rhythm. When I turned my head slightly, the strands followed. Not pulling, not releasing, just following. A single hair slid across my cheek. It traced the line of my jaw and stopped at the corner of my mouth. It stayed there, still and weightless. I could taste metal when I breathed. Copper, faint and clean, like blood before it dries. My body refused to move. The weight of stillness pinned me harder than any hand could. I waited for it to end, for something to pull back. It didn't. I must have fallen asleep again, though the thought itself feels wrong. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the same position. The lamp had burned out. The room glowed faintly red, as if lit from behind the walls. The Dreamcatcher still hung above, its threads longer now, almost reaching the floor. In the dark, they glistened faintly, moving like slow veins in water. The air trembled each time I inhaled. I lifted my hand, and the hair around my wrist slid away without resistance. It didn't pull, didn't retreat. It simply adjusted, as if the movement had been expected. The moment I stopped breathing, everything froze. When I exhaled again, the entire room seemed to shift with the air. And then I understood. It wasn't following my breath. It was breathing with me. By the time the first light crept through the blinds, I hadn't slept. The strands were gone. The Dreamcatcher was still. Only the faint marks on my wrist remained, thin and pale, like threads pressed into skin. I touched them once, lightly. They were warm. When I finally woke, it was quiet enough to make me doubt the sound of my own breathing. The air had cooled, the walls looked dry, and for a moment, I almost believed the night had been a dream. The marks on my wrist were pale, barely visible in the morning light, and yet each pulse beneath them seemed slower than it should have been, like the blood was waiting for something. The room looked the same, but sameness can be a trick. Every detail had a kind of precision that only dreams have. The curtain moved when I blinked, but not when the wind touched it. The air smelled of detergent, not iron. And still, the faintest sweetness lingered, like something trying to remind me it existed. I sat on the bed and waited for sound to return. It didn't. The refrigerator was silent. No cars outside, not even the usual hum of the highway. Only the weight of stillness pressing down from the ceiling. The Dreamcatcher hung where I had left it, perfectly centered above the light. It didn't move. The threads were dry now, tangled, as if nothing had ever happened. I watched it for a long time, just to be sure it was real. I dressed quickly. My shirt stuck slightly to my back. The fabric was damp, though I hadn't been sweating. I checked the mirror before leaving. The reflection looked tired, hollow-eyed, but normal enough to believe. The marks on my wrist were gone. At least that's what I told myself. Under certain angles, the skin caught the light just enough to reveal faint ridges, circular, almost braided. I closed my bag, checked the door, and hesitated. The handle felt colder than it should. Not cold from metal, but from the kind of chill that settles deep into a thing that hasn't been touched in a long time. The door opened on the first try. Light rushed in, thin and colorless. The outside air smelled alive, like rain before it falls. I stepped out, and yet, for a heartbeat, I felt the same air follow me, as though the room exhaled after I left. The motel parking lot was empty. No cars, no clerk behind the office window. The sign still flickered, but no sound came from it. I thought about knocking on the next door, but every door looked the same, closed, quiet, waiting. I turned toward my car. The driver's window was fogged from the inside. When I opened the door, the smell hit me again. Metal and dust. It was faint, but it was the same. On the passenger seat lay a single strand of black hair, too long to be mine. I picked it up carefully. It clung to my fingers, then slid off on its own, as if it didn't need me anymore. I left the engine running and looked back toward the motel room. The curtain had shifted. Someone, or something, had moved it just enough to let the light through. But the window was closed. I went back inside. The air was colder now. Not winter cold, empty cold, the kind that comes from places where warmth used to live. The Dreamcatcher still hung there, but the red in the thread had faded to brown. It looked harmless, old, meaningless. Then I saw it. On the bed, a small pile of hair, neatly coiled where I'd been sleeping. At first, I thought it had fallen from the Dreamcatcher, but it wasn't the same. These strands were lighter, brown, with thin copper glints when the light hit. My color. I reached out before realizing what I was doing. It was still warm in a way hair shouldn't be, as though it had just been cut from living skin. I dropped it. It didn't fall like hair. It landed softly, as if the air caught it halfway down. I wanted to burn it, to throw the Dreamcatcher away, leave the key, walk until the sound of my own thoughts disappeared. But the body doesn't always follow the mind. I stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything, to move. Nothing did. And that silence was worse than any sound. When I turned to leave again, the reflection in the mirror caught my eye. It wasn't the room behind me that made me stop. It was the space above my head. The Dreamcatcher was still there, but in the reflection, it was swaying, gently, patiently. Its threads reached a little lower than they did in the room. I turned around. It was still. Of course it was. But when I looked back at the mirror, one of the strands brushed the glass. It left a faint smear, like oil from a fingertip. I left the room without locking it. The key was too heavy in my hand, and the idea of keeping it felt wrong, as if the door should stay open for whatever still breathed inside. Outside, the wind had returned. I could hear the highway again, faint, distant, normal. The world had resumed itself. For a moment, I almost believed it was over. But as I closed the car door, I saw something move in the rear-view mirror. A shape, faint and red, hanging just above the passenger seat. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The thread swayed once, and I realized the car's air vent wasn't blowing. It was breathing. I drove back toward the bridge because I needed to see it once more. The highway felt cleaner in daylight. Clear sky, dry asphalt, but none of it looked real. Every few miles I checked the rearview mirror, certain I'd see the red thread again. It never appeared. Still, the air inside the car felt heavier than it should. The radio refused to catch a station, only static. I turned it off, and the silence folded in around me like cloth. My wrist itched where the faint ridges had been, and I kept rubbing them as though I could erase the shape of the night. When the bridge finally came into view, it looked smaller than I remembered. The market below it was gone. No tables, no bulbs, no people. Only wet earth and the marks of tires that led nowhere. The smell, though, was the same. Iron and rain, and the sweetness that didn't belong to either. I parked where the gravel turned soft and climbed down. The river was low, slow, whispering. I found the place where the old woman's table had been. A flat patch of mud with the imprint of wooden legs still pressed into it. Something small gleamed there, half buried. I brushed away the dirt. A circle of black thread, frayed and brittle. When I lifted it, the pattern was familiar, twisted, uneven. A piece of the Dreamcatcher, maybe the one she had tied around it. The thread clung to my finger even after I let go. It was warm. I should have left then. Instead, I waited. The wind under the bridge moved like breath through hollow pipes. Somewhere beneath the water, metal knocked against stone. Slow, irregular. The sound matched my heartbeat without trying. I thought about calling out, about asking if anyone was there, but the words dried up before they reached my mouth. There was nothing to answer, just the air listening. A figure appeared on the opposite bank for a moment, small, bent, wearing gray. I blinked, and the shape dissolved into mist. The sound of metal stopped. Only the river kept whispering, a language that almost made sense if I didn't listen too hard. I dropped the thread. It didn't sink. It floated, turning slowly in the current, the red fibers catching what little light the clouds allowed. Back in the car, my hands smelled of wet rust. I wiped them on my jeans, but the smell stayed, soaking through fabric and skin. The road out of town was empty, lined with telephone poles that leaned too far over the ditch. Each one hummed faintly as I passed. The same low vibration that had followed me out of sleep. I turned on the radio again. For a second, between the static, I heard a woman's breath. Not a voice, just breath. It rose once, then cut out. The next second, the sound came from the car's air vent instead. Soft, steady, familiar. The smell of copper filled the cabin. I didn't look up right away. I didn't need to. The shadow on the windshield was already there, round, thin, swaying. I drove faster. Wind poured through the half-open window, but the shadow stayed in place. It didn't flicker with the light. It moved to the rhythm of my breathing. By the time I reached the next town, the sun was gone again. I stopped at a gas station and stepped out. The air felt clean, normal. I told myself it was over. Inside the restroom, under fluorescent light, I washed my hands until the smell faded. When I looked up, the mirror was streaked with condensation, though the air was dry. A single strand of black hair clung to the glass, curled into a perfect circle. It quivered when I breathed. I wiped it away. The smear it left looked like a fingerprint. Outside, the night had turned red near the horizon. The clouds stretched thin and low, threaded together as if by something unseen. I opened the car door. For a moment, the interior was completely dark. Then the dash lights flickered once, and in that brief light I saw it. The Dreamcatcher, hanging above the passenger seat, turning slowly as if it had always been there. The threads were black again, the feathers red. One of them brushed my shoulder when I sat down. It didn't move. Neither did I. The engine started by itself. The air vent sighed once, and the car filled with the smell of copper and dust. I didn't turn off the headlights. I didn't look back toward the bridge. The Dreamcatcher swayed gently above me, steady in the air that wasn't blowing. It breathed once, quietly, just to remind me it still could.